Hey folks, today I've got a really interesting video on a product that I've been testing for almost 2 months. Now, if you didn't catch my previous video on the Viega water zoning manifold install, I mentioned in that video that that whole project started out of a desire to install another product in my mechanical area, but I couldn't because I didn't have the real estate, you know, with all the spaghetti mess of wires and pipes and such. So that whole project started out of what I'm going to present in today's video. Now, if you didn't catch that video on the Viega water zoning manifold, I'll put a card up above and a link in the description below. But basically that project was a success in that it freed up the real estate in my mechanical area in the RV. And so you probably figured out what I was creating a room for. You can see back here in my mechanical space, right there in the center of the frame, that silver box, about the size of 2 bricks stacked on one another. And that is an electric heater. Now you might be thinking, what in the world is so special, so important about an electric heater, right? I mean, if you're an RVer, you know that if you're RVing in the winter months, that living off of propane fuel to heat your coach is just not practical. You spend so much money. And so just about every RVer will supplement with electric space heaters. So what is so special about this particular electric heater, right? I mean, in other words, why is this one so special and worthy of dedicating an entire video to? Well, let me back up a little and give you some context. If you're one of my subscribers, you probably know that I do not winterize my RV in the winter months, mainly for 2 reasons. The first is we don't get that cold here in Georgia. I mean, we certainly do get temperatures below freezing here and there in the winter months, but it's pretty rare for us to have, you know, several consecutive days where it's in the 20s or lower all day long, all night long, okay? And so that's one reason. The second is I don't winterize because we still use the RV in the winter months. I mean, we'll probably do a couple camping trips here and there, and so I just prefer to keep it ready to use year-round. And so on those perhaps, let's say 12 to 15 days or nights in total in the winter months where it does drop below freezing and the RV is, you know, just sitting here in storage unused, then I'll just set the thermostat, of course, in my RV to say 45, 50 degrees, and then the giant 40,000 BTU propane furnace that kicks on, it spills some of that heat over into the underbelly through the ducts and whatnot, and that's what keeps things from, of course, freezing in the RV. And so that's precisely what I've done for several years now with both this RV and the other ones that I've owned before that. And, you know, the downside is that propane is not cheap. You know, it's getting more expensive lately. And so I might burn through maybe $150, $200 in propane over the entire winter. And that's not horrible, but that's money spent, you know, just when my RV is sitting in storage here and not in use. And on that note, if you're one of my subscribers, I did kind of an informal poll, a survey a couple weeks back, and I asked how much propane you consume per month if you are a full-timer, you know, living in your RV. And so if you're curious on those results, I'll throw up a screenshot of the final tally. But about 2 months back, right before Christmas 2022, you probably remember most of us had that extreme cold spell. I think it impacted just about everyone, you know, in the Southeast, even going up the East Coast. And this is where the temperatures dropped into the single digits, and we were, you know, well under freezing temps for several consecutive days. In fact, I did a separate video on how well my RV survived when it was 26 degrees below freezing. It was a record-breaking 6 degrees here. And then I, you know, pulled out a thermal infrared camera and I showed where the RV was leaking. And so if you didn't catch that video, I'll put a card up as well. But anyway, it just seemed like we had a lot of colder weather this winter for some reason. And you know, it's kind of frustrating then to burn through so much propane like that, especially when I'm just storing the RV and it's not actually in use. Now, of course, like me, you've probably experimented with alternate sources of heat to, you know, mitigate your propane consumption. And I'll admit that previously I've tried an inexpensive portable space heater, this exact one here. I've got a couple of these, and you know, sometimes we use this on the inside of the RV while we're camping in the winter, right, when we want to conserve on propane, and these typically work just fine. Of course, you never want to plug this into an extension cord or an outlet strip, But I've always been nervous about leaving one of these in an area unattended, you know, basically putting it somewhere, setting it, and then forgetting it. But I've got to admit that I have done it before. I would not recommend it. I mean, I've never had anything bad happen, but this is really not the safest way to heat an unoccupied space, especially where there's, you know, ignition sources such as the propane furnace or even the propane water heater. But like I said, I'll admit that I have done this at times reluctantly, and it did get the job done. I mean, it did keep the underbelly and the mechanical areas, you know, warm enough where I didn't have to then engage the propane furnace. But then I heard about this electric heater that's designed specifically not just for RVs but for boat bilges, you know, where the boat engine is located, other mechanical components, kind of really similar to the mechanical space here in an RV where you have fuel lines, you know, ignition sources. I mean, things like the furnace back there, or in the case of a boat, the main engine, or even a generator. And so basically this company here, Xtreme Heaters, they developed this all-electric heater with the safety mechanisms to legitimately heat those kinds of spaces with the right safeguards in place. And so right about the same time that we got that Arctic blast around Christmas, I ordered the 800 watt version from Xtreme Heaters, and so I've been testing it since then here in my RV. And basically, spoiler alert, since then, get this, I have not had to use a single gallon of propane to protect my RV against freezing. And so for over 2 months now, I've been keeping my RV protected against freezing with nothing more than this 800 watt electric heater from Xtreme Heaters. And I've been very impressed with this little guy. I mean, it is really a purpose-built heater that's designed exactly for this scenario. And so in the remainder of the video, I'm gonna give you the details on how this little electric heater can cut your propane use down, and essentially the different scenarios and parameters that must exist in order for really something like this to work in your RV and to get the right results. And again, it's very purpose built, and so it's really only intended, I think, to operate by itself essentially. Now, in full disclosure, as I've been testing it over the last 2 months, you know, obviously every single day and night here in Georgia, it doesn't get below freezing. And so even though I say I've been testing it for 2 months, in reality, I've had to wait patiently for those, you know, dozen or so nights where it actually dropped below freezing to really be able to, you know, truly test and get an idea of how it performs. But I did capture quite a bit of data with different temperature sensors in place, and so I'm going to share that in just a bit. But first, let me talk about why I placed the heater in my mechanical space back there, why I chose that specific location, because this is going to vary, you know, greatly depending on your RV's floor plan and the layout and such. So first, you'll notice that it's in an area where I would say probably about 80% of the vulnerable water lines are located and such. And so really, if I can keep this mechanical space, you know, above freezing, then I'm protecting pretty much the majority of the vulnerable parts in my RV. You can see I've got my wet bay over here, and then of course directly behind the wet bay is where that water manifold system is, and then all the water lines, you know, branch out and go to different areas of my RV. But really most of them are all in this vicinity. I mean, I've got the bathroom directly above up here, and then some other water lines that go to the washer dryer in the nose there. I've got, you know, a gray tank underneath here and a black tank. And so really the bulk of it's all in this vicinity. Now I'll point out this is a traditional mid-bunk floor plan. You can see the mid-bunk slide right there, of course. And so really that just leaves the water lines that are running back to my kitchen island, which is just behind the axles here, kind of centered up on that window over the stove, but in the middle of the RV. And Jayco actually does a pretty good job running those. They do it right up against the subfloor and in the center of the RV. And so they're pretty well protected, you know, against the extremes. And then I've got a second gray tank just over the axles, and then a freshwater tank behind that. And so really the most vulnerable remaining water line is the one that runs to my ice line on the back of the refrigerator, and that's behind this access panel right here. And so that one obviously runs outside the frame. It's flexible to feed that ice line. And so, you know, I've got it double wrapped with pipe insulation. That's really the best that I can do given that it's exposed. But then the rest is on the inside of the underbelly there. And so my concern is I want to make sure that that part of the underbelly gets some heat. In fact, I've got a BM Pro temperature sensor just on the other side of the I-beam down here for that reason, because I know that's probably the most vulnerable area, you know, right in here to protect against freezing in my case. But going back to why I placed the Xtreme heater right here, you'll notice that back here, there's a circle cutout in this, we'll call it a bulkhead. And this is actually where the main frame right here connects to the drop frame portion underneath here. And so there's a little circle cutout back here that leads directly back into the main frame area. And so that's, you know, where the vulnerable water lines are. So really I wanted to place the heater in a spot where there's hope of some of that hot air going back there in the main section of the frame where those water lines are located. I mean, I'll have plenty of hot air in this basement mechanical area, you know, with the heater running, but I wanted to try to send some of that hot air back into the main frame section there with the underbelly. And so that's why I chose this specific area to mount, you know, and locate the Xtreme heater. Now it's designed to be permanently mounted. You can see the screw holes there. I've got it mounted to the frame. And so once it's installed, you plug it in and literally there's nothing else that you ever have to do, which by the way, that's another thing that I really like about this product. You know, like I said before, it is a purpose-built unit and there's no on or off switch. I mean, there's no thermostat, you know, that you could accidentally bump or something like that. There's no settings. Literally, you just plug it in and then it's going to run its mission that it's been pre-programmed for. And basically that program is as follows. When it's plugged in, the thermostat here that's on the back of the heater, it's going to call for heat once the ambient temperature is 40 degrees or lower. And so the minute that my air back here in the mechanical area here, it hits 40 degrees or less, then that Xtreme heater is going to automatically turn on and start producing heat. And then it's going to run continuously until that same ambient temperature here in this space hits about 55 degrees. Now the heat that it produces, it's actually forced air. It's got a 400 CFM fan on the inlet, which is, you know, pretty decent for something this size. So not only is it producing hot air, just like a portable space heater, but then it's circulating that hot air. So it's almost like having a mini fan in front of a space heater, you know, blowing all that air around. And what that does is it helps circulate the air, especially in an enclosed space like this. And that's really what makes this a game changer, is it's circulating more air, you know, constantly moving air around to keep everything in a safe temperature range. And surprisingly, it's even able to send some of that hot air through that hole into the rear underbelly there. Well, let me mention a couple other likes on it and then I'll share the actual performance data. I like that you can mount the heater in any position. So right now I've got it mounted kind of horizontally, but you could mount it upside down, you could mount it vertically, you know, on its side. It doesn't matter what orientation. I also like that it's clearly labeled. It's got the intake on this side, the output or the exhaust on the opposite. But even then, I'll just mention that that output side, the exhaust where the hot air is coming out, it's not so hot, and that includes the enclosure itself that's metal. It's not so hot that you could melt you know, nearby hose. You can see I've got some gas lines here, some water lines, or even if you have an electrical cable nearby, it's not so hot that it could melt something like that if it got too close. And that's something I really like. You know, I mean, it's forcing out that hot air, but it's not going to burn your hand if you were to touch the enclosure or even the output side there while it's actually running. And so that's something that's kind of unique compared to a conventional space heater, depending on the brand. You know, if you touch it where the output is, you might almost burn your finger. And so that's something really unique. I like the way that they made this, you know, safely to operate in an environment like that. You don't have to worry about clearances and, you know, hoses and cables getting too close to it. I also really like that it has a 15-foot, really nice, thick, beefy cord that is attached to it. Now, of course, you never want to plug something like this into an extension cord or an outlet strip, but I like that they gave you 15 feet because you can see I've got it running here neatly, and it actually runs all the way over to this side where I've got an outlet. But you can see even then I've got plenty of excess cord that's wrapped up there. So I really like that they gave you 15 feet. So I think for the average user, you're going to have plenty of room to connect this to a power outlet, even if you've got an outlet that's a pretty good distance from where you want to put the heater. Now, I pulled it out for just a moment so I can give you some closer views of it. But check out, first off, the size of this unit. It's only 8 inches across. Then we've got 3.5 inches wide there and just over 5 inches tall. So, I mean, it's a very small, compact unit, which really gives you a lot of flexibility as far as where you want to mount it and put it in your RV. On this side, it's got the air intake, and I mean, basically it's like a fan that you'd find on a server or a PC, just a really powerful fan. And so that's where the air is going to go in on this side. Down here we've got a thermostat, and that's basically telling the unit when to turn on and when to turn off. And then a real simple power indicator there, and you can see the different colors it changes. Green standby, red heating, orange cooling, and then green blink is a self-test. And then it's got an attached power cable here, and that's it. There's no power switch or anything whatsoever, so that when you plug it in, you know, it's going to run a mission. It's a very specific purpose to keep the temperature from freezing. And so I think the size is a huge pro. I mean, this thing is really compact, and you can put it pretty much wherever you want. And this is actually the largest model they offer. This is the 800 watt version. They also have a smaller 600 watt and 400 watt that are just a little bit shorter here on the length. But I think for RVers, I think most of us are going to want this larger 800 watt model, just given the sheer, you know, cubic volume of air that we're trying to heat. But let me transition now to sharing the actual performance data that I collected, and that'll give you an idea of how it performed. And so, like I mentioned, I've been testing it for almost 2 months in storage here. But in reality, we've only had about a dozen or so nights where the outside temperature has been, you know, below freezing. And so for the sake of the video, I'm only going to show you the data for the nights where it actually dipped into the mid-20s, staying there for at least 8 hours or more, because that's really the most extreme real-world data that I've got. And I think it'll give you a pretty good idea of what the heater is capable of. Now, the way that I recorded all this data is I've got kind of a hodgepodge of temperature sensors. I've got one temperature sensor that reads in through the BM Pro system, and that sensor is just on the other side of the I-beam back here in the main section of the underbelly. And so that represents, for me, in my case, really the most extreme location where the most vulnerable water lines are. You know, it's just on the opposite side of the I-beam there, right next to the unconditioned outside air. And so that's one temperature sensor. Then I've got another Govee temperature sensor here in the mechanical space, you can see back here, and that is on the opposite side of the Xtreme heater back there, because I didn't want that temperature sensor over here getting, you know, thrown off or influenced too much if it was too close. So that's kind of on the opposite side here of this whole mechanical space where the actual heater is located back there. And then last, I've got one more temperature sensor right here. This is the Sensor Push brand, but I've got this one more in my basement storage, which is really just separated by this thin sheet of wood to the mechanical space. Then as far as my living space goes, I've got 3 more built-in temperature sensors. I've got one up here in the master bedroom, kind of in the nose, a second one by the entry door, and then I've got a third one in the mid bunk room that's just inside this slide right here. And so I've got quite a bit of temperature sensors, quite a bit of data between all that to really give us an idea of what's going on with the temperature. All right, well, let me show you the data that I collected, and I've typed it out in a spreadsheet, so I'll put that up to make it easier to read and follow. But I'll also try to cycle through some of the actual screenshots of the raw data from those sensors, and that way you can see where I pull the numbers from. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you 4 nights, basically the coldest nights that I encountered testing it out. Now, some of you are camping in areas where the temps are consistently in the single digits or even colder perhaps. And so I realize what I'm showing you, it's not the most extreme tests conceivable. I mean, you can see my results there. The outside temperatures are only in the mid to upper 20s. But I will say that I made sure it remained at those temps for at least 8 hours overnight, you know, to really give it a fair assessment in the end. All right, so the first column there is the outside temperature recorded. And of course, these are all in Fahrenheit. So notice how the first data set, number 1, has an outside temperature of 26 degrees. And then at the same time, I check all the other sensors and record the remainder. So notice how the mechanical room temperature is 54 degrees. And remember, that's the sensor that's on the opposite side of the mechanical space, so opposite the heater. And given it's in the same enclosed space where the heater is, you know, naturally it's going to register the most heat. And again, that's where 80% of my vulnerable water lines are. So that's great news. I mean, 54 degrees inside and then 26 degrees outside. And if you go down the different data sets, you'll see that it pretty much stays right in the low 50s consistently in that mechanical area with the Xtreme heater running. And of course that makes sense because the Xtreme heater, remember, it's programmed to run continuously until it reaches about 55 degrees there. But notice also on the basement storage temperature that I recorded, that's separated, remember, just by a thin wall of plywood. And that sensor registered consistently in the mid to upper 40s the entire time. Then check out the rear, the underbelly sensor. You know, this is really, in my case, the furthest location, furthest away from the Xtreme heater at least. And that sensor is right up against the I-beam, the main I-beam. So no insulation or anything like that. I mean, that sensor right there, it's consistently registering upper 30s, 36, 37, you can see there throughout the tests. And again, that's with zero propane all night long. Now, I should mention my underbelly is sealed up. I'm not going to go into all those details in this video, but I'll put a card up above for a separate one if you're interested on you know, more details on that. But basically, my underbelly, it's just a thin sheet of corrugated plastic, but it's sealed all the way around the perimeter against that I-beam. And then there's just a sheet of Reflectrix inside, and that's it. There's no other insulation, you know, no fiberglass bats or anything like that. And so with all that hot air coming out of the Xtreme heater, it's able to keep that temperature sensor on the inside of that I-beam on the main section there at 36 or 37 degrees. And again, that's when the outside temperature has been 25 to 27 degrees all night. So basically a 10 degree differential. And personally, I think that's pretty impressive, you know, considering all things, especially in contrast to the location of the heater itself. And remember, it's just putting a little bit of hot air through that hole in the bulkhead of that main frame section. And then if you're interested in the rest of the sensors in the living space, you can pause and see how those fared. But again, I had no additional heat sources in use, just the Xtreme heater, except for, you'll notice that last data set number 4. And you'll see there, in that case, I actually turned on the 5,000 BTU electric fireplace, and that's in the rear of my coach, almost in the very back there, the electric fireplace. And so I turned that on that last run just to see, you know, what would that do to the rest of the coach? Would that throw off or interfere with the temperature for the Xtreme heater to come on and off, you know, the way it's programmed? But you can see the difference clearly when I turned that 5,000 BTU electric fireplace on. Basically, it seemed to only impact the living space. So those temperatures, you know, went a little bit higher in the living space, but it didn't seem to really impact the basement storage so much. So that's kind of interesting to see how that fireplace, that electric fireplace, interfaces at the same time. But I mean, based on all the data that I collected with all the sensors, and of course my limitations of the weather only getting to the mid to upper 20s, the big question in my mind is, at what point is the temperature outside too cold for the all-electric heater to be successful in its mission, especially, you know, keeping that furthest area of my underbelly on the other side of that bulkhead, you know, keeping that space warm enough where it's above freezing. And, you know, I'd love to be able to test my coach in a more extreme weather. Maybe I can do that next winter if it gets colder. But in the meantime, what I've done is I've extrapolated the existing data that I recorded, and then I came up with some educated guesses as to what it might look like if the outside temperature was even colder. And so let me show you that data. And again, these are just my best estimations based on everything that I observed so far from testing, and I could be off. But I created 3 more hypothetical outside temperatures, starting at 20 degrees, then 15 degrees, and then 5. And then I filled in the remaining columns based on where I think, and that's the key word here, where I think the rest of the sensors would likely fall. And again, these are my guesses, so keep that in mind. And I also came up with these numbers factoring in the help of that 5000 BTU electric fireplace, running in the rear of the coach. Because here's my thinking, once you get to 20 degrees and below outside, I think you're really gonna need some extra heat in the actual living space, especially since storage, to keep it in that safe range, because after all, that's where all the water lines end up terminating. But my best estimations indicate that when temperatures get to around 15 degrees and below outside, with everything else the same in the coach, no new insulation, nothing else different, then at the 15 degrees, at that mark, hypothetically, I think that the furthest temperature sensor in the rear underbelly, in my case, it would probably start to register temps below freezing. So you can see I put 30 degrees as a guess. I think the mechanical space in the basement storage area, I think that area would fare just fine. It's probably going to be in the upper 30s to low 40s at that rate. But given the Xtreme Heater, in my case, only has that small little circle cutout in the frame where it transitions to push, warm air in that rearward direction, I think that's probably when things are going to start to freeze up and get below freezing along that area, especially during, extended longer temperature drops. And then I think if you got down to 5 degrees outside, you can see on that one, I don't think you'd have any issues, again, keeping the mechanical area itself above 32, because again, that Xtreme Heater is going to be running constantly at that rate. But I think as you get further out, even into the basement storage and beyond, I could see where maybe that residual heat that it's generating is perhaps struggling to make its way to the extremities. So I think it's at that point that, in my case, I'd probably have to start supplementing with the propane furnace, to keep things from freezing. Which, speaking of, all this time I've been talking about using the Xtreme Heater for just a storage situation, right? Where the RV isn't being used, just being stored, like in my case. And so that brings us to an interesting question, and that is, how would this all-electric Xtreme Heater perform while you're actually living in the RV, right? I mean, if you're actually at a campsite, below freezing temperatures, the question in my mind is, would you have any advantage with the Xtreme Heater on board in your RV? And remember, the Xtreme Heater, it's pre-programmed to turn on only when the surrounding ambient air is 40 degrees or less, and then it stays on till that ambient air reaches about 55 degrees. And my thoughts are, if you're out camping, and you're running your propane furnace just a little bit because it's below freezing perhaps, maybe it's even set to a modest 60 degrees in the living area, right? Well, each time that furnace turns on, it's going to be dumping some of that hot air into the underbelly and the mechanical space, right? Because it's designed that way to not, let those areas get below freezing. But remember, that Xtreme Heater is only going to kick on if the temperature gets below 40 degrees in your mechanical space or wherever you got it mounted, right? And so if that propane furnace is dumping enough hot air into your mechanical air, your underbelly, well, then the Xtreme Heater, it's not even going to turn on in the first place. And remember, you cannot adjust the threshold on the Xtreme Heater. It is preset. You can't adjust it. So my thought would be, if I'm out camping and I want to actually make use of the all-electric Xtreme Heater, then I need to divert more of that hot furnace air coming out of my propane furnace. I need to keep as much of that as possible only in the living space and keep it out of the underbelly, perhaps in the mechanical space. Now, in my case here in my Jayco Pinnacle, you can see the back of the propane furnace here and the ducts coming out, feeding the trunk lines and such. But just for example, I've got really 2 sources of heat that are coming off of the propane furnace that are feeding this mechanical space here in the adjacent basement storage. storage. And the first one is this small duct right here. This is kind of an interesting detail. Jayco ran this duct right to the black tank valve. It's right down there and it terminates right at the valve there. So they did that, I imagine, to keep that black tank valve from freezing, when it gets really cold. So that's kind of an interesting detail. And of course, right next to it is the gray tank. So that's nice that they put that there to force that hot air coming from the propane furnace down there at those, vulnerable points. But this space is all connected. You can see very close to where the Xtreme heater is. So if I was going to use this and also have the propane furnace running at the same time and hope that this would turn on, I would need to probably divert and relocate this duct here. I'd probably just push it back into that main frame section back there so that it's dumping that hot air back further away from the electric heater. And then in my adjacent basement storage, I've got this louvered register up here on the underside of the trunk line, so I'd want to make sure this is shut. In fact, I might even just tape it up so it's sealed. And then the only heat from the propane furnace is really just the bleed off, from all the connections, from all the heat, which in my case I've sealed with some mastic at all the connections, so I think it would be minimal. But then and only then, I think, would I really give the all-electric Xtreme heater the opportunity to turn on in the first place, since the temperature down here would probably be cool enough, under that 40-degree marker for it to turn on in the first place. And I think it probably would turn on if I made those modifications to the two different supplies there that I mentioned, especially if the outside temperature was below 32 degrees. And then perhaps another related scenario that comes to mind would be maybe you're just using your electric fireplace in the RV plus some portable space heaters in your living space, to be all electric. And then I think the Xtreme heater being in your mechanical space would serve its purpose in the basement or the underbelly of your RV. And I think at that point you're going to be all electric. But either way, I don't know that the Xtreme heater was specifically designed to be used, in conjunction with other heat sources like that. I think it's really more intended for a storage situation. But I do think there are possibilities there. In fact, I even thought, what if I had two Xtreme heaters, the existing one that's in my mechanical space by the basement storage, and then what if I had a second one here in the rear of the underbelly of the coach, maybe pointing toward that freshwater tank, and so then I've got two of them running at the same time. That would be a really interesting application to see how two of them would perform simultaneously. But anyway, that's a big hypothetical, but I thought I'd throw it out there. Certainly would love to hear what you guys think about all this, so definitely drop me a comment below. Well, I want to close out the video by discussing one dislike that I have with this Xtreme heater, and that is the cost. So far, I've not mentioned anything about the cost. In fact, when I first heard about this, I knew it'd be more expensive than a regular space heater. I was thinking probably in the $150, $200 price point. But to my surprise, the 800 watt model, this is the more powerful one that they make, this one is priced at $469 typically. Maybe you can get it closer to $400 with a promo code, but still, $400, in my opinion, that seemed just a little bit high. I just didn't expect it to be that expensive. And in fairness, it is purpose built. It does solve a really big problem for RVers, but in my opinion, just me personally, I thought it would be just a little bit more affordable. So would I buy it all over again, even with no change to the price? Well, yeah, it solves a big problem for RVers, and at the end of the day, if I'm using the Xtreme heater, I could probably get away with zero propane consumption while my RV is in storage without winterizing, And so that means it'll likely pay for itself probably within 2 to 3 years, 2 to 3 winter seasons, based on the current cost of propane versus the cost of electricity. And for those curious, the estimated cost to run this 800 watt model, it's less than 5 cents per hour. So you'd have to run it nonstop for over 24 hours before you'd even spend $1 in electricity. And that's peanuts in comparison to the cost of propane that I consume. And so from that perspective, it seems like a pretty good value. Plus, just the peace of mind that it's always going to be turning on at the right time. You don't have to set anything. You literally just plug it and forget about it. So yeah, I'd definitely buy it all over again. All right, well, that's all I've got on the review for the all-electric Xtreme heater. But I'd love to hear from you, especially those of you that have way more experience than I do camping in much colder climates. You know, based on what you've seen in today's video, what I presented, do you think this would work in your setup, and is it worth it in the end? So definitely let us know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. As always, thanks for watching.